Well, hello there again. Hello there. Sorry, that was my best Ben Kenobi, or Obi-Wan Kenobi. Hello there. Ah, yeah, that's pretty silly. Anyway, it's late at night here, and I've just gotten the 99,000th request uh, about my tone, about how I get the tone I get, my advice on tone and guitar playing, and how I get the tones and how I match the tones so well that I do. And so finally, after just responding a billion times the same way, I'm just going to make a video about it. And so whenever anybody has any questions about how I get my guitar tones, how I get how I match tones to songs, things like that, just refer to this video, because this is going to be the answer for all of it. So whenever anybody asks me from this point forward, man, how do you get that great tone? I'm just going to give this link and say, watch this. That's going to be it. So there it is. Okay, so there it is. This isn't one specific person. Many people have asked me this, but it's just like after getting asked so many times, I figured I might as well just make a video. And I've made 3 videos in one day, so that's going to screw up the YouTube algorithm. So please watch my Jay Giles video or give it a like or whatever. And, watch my advice video if you want, because you won't be notified. And tomorrow I'm making another video, going to be another REO Speedwagon song. But, look for it if you can, if you want to watch that. It'll be coming up tomorrow, probably midday around that time. Another REO Speedwagon song. And it'll be done to a backing track this time, so I'll be doing my best Gary Richrath, Richrath, I can't remember how to pronounce his last name, but Gary was a legend, and I'll be copying his playing, but I'll be improvising at the same time. So I'll be not only doing parts that he did, but I'll be also going off on tangents, which I know after reading interviews with him that he would appreciate, because a lot of people just don't like to be imitated. They want you to put your own style into it. So Eddie Van Halen was the same way. So anyway, I will begin now. We're talking about tone. Now, I've gotten asked many times, how do I get that great guitar tone that I get? How do I do it? Well, I use anything from regular amps to amp sims to effects processors through the computer and things like that. I'll do that kind of stuff, and I've done it before. I've got videos where I've used my newest processor I bought, which was an MG30 or an MG300, which is a NUX, otherwise known as NUX, NUX. Looks like it says NUX, but it's actually NU-X. I don't know. But they've got an effects processor, the MG300, and I've used that to make a few videos. Some Boston and some Zappa, but I was going to say Sabbath, but it started to come out as a Z, so Zabbath. But, and I'll use that. So I'll use a variety of different things. The way that I can match the tones in any particular album or with particular guitars and stuff is that I've been playing for 43 plus years. I started in 1978, around mid-year, I believe. So I've been playing over 43 years. And so over that time, I've learned which guitars sound like which pickups sound like which. So I can recognize these things. And effects and things along those lines, I can recognize those too, because I remember what they sound like, because I use them on a regular basis. And using, there are a lot of guitar players who actually frown on using amp sims and things like that, which I don't fully understand, but purists are purists. They're gonna, be like, unless you got a tube amp, it's gonna sound like shit. Solid state sounds like, oh my god, that was going on for a long time. Solid state sounds like crap. It's just like, no, it doesn't. And with today's technology, everything sounds fantastic. I mean, hell, my PV. I had a PV Encore in the late '80s, and I used that with just a EQ pedal. There's the key. Those two little letters, EQ. And I also used an Overdrive Plus. And so I had this PV Encore 65, this cheap 12-inch speaker tube amp, which was awesome. I loved it. And I would plug in my two pedals, which I could only afford. I only afforded two pedals. I think I had maybe one or two others later on, but they didn't really last long, I don't think. I had a delay for a little while, and then I ended up selling it because I didn't use it very often. I don't know why. I was just weird back then. I was young. And I got different tones. We did everything with that, with just the PV and the Overdrive Plus pedal for distortion, and the distortion on the amp, and also the EQ pedal and the EQ on the amp. We were able to do everything in the bands I was in. We were able to do everything from U2 to Metallica. And it's all a matter of knowing how to use an equalizer. Equalizers are so important. People don't realize how much they're important. I mean, look at any kind of recording studio. See that big console there? I mean, that's basically just a giant EQ. And they can, the skilled engineer can sit there at that console and they can adjust little nuances on the sound. They could go, oh, well, the guitar needs a little more mid-range, I'll put that up. It needs a little back off a little bit more on the mid-range, or it needs a little more low end, or it needs a little less end. And they'll do that. Plus, they have all sorts of EQs back there next to the rack, or even on the rack itself. Or not the rack, the console, the recording console. At the studio. And that's how these things are made. A lot of these albums you're hearing, they aren't, if you played through like Eddie Van Halen's rig straight off without being mixed through the console, it would sound a bit different. And a lot of the magic that you hear on these record albums is done on the console, and that's why these producers are so good. Def Leppard, they would be nowhere without Mutt Lange. Mutt Lange made them, basically, and he brought them to superstardom. Why? Because the guy's a genius. The guy was amazing in the recording studio. He could hear stuff that other people couldn't, and it wasn't something you could teach. You can't teach people to hear for tone. You have to learn it. It has to be something that you learn over time. It takes time. You have to know what does a fuzz pedal sound like? What does a wah pedal sound like? What does too much mid-range sound like? What does too much low-end sound like? What does too little low-end sound like? I mean, these are things you have to listen for. And if you're going to match tones, so you want specific tones, then you have to know how they are. And if you can't figure that out, then go read about what other people have done to match tones. As far as adjusting an EQ, like with, say, Boston. People went nuts chasing the Boston tone, and I was one of them. And the thing was, people actually went so far as to find a picture, or somebody snuck in or something and took a picture of Tom Scholz's EQ pedal, which he had between two amp heads to get the original 1976 Boston sound. He had just a tubes glowing Marshall amp, the Plexi, and burning tubes like crazy, cranked, and he didn't have his, he did, he invented the power soak that he used. He built it himself, and so he could crank that amp and not blow speakers, and it was basically a type of variac. And so he did that, and he put an EQ in between it, and then he put another EQ after the two amps. So you got a Marshall head, an EQ, a Marshall head, and then a 10-band EQ, and then the speakers. The power soak, and then the speakers. I think that's the way the chain went, but I don't know where the power soak was exactly because I don't use one, so I couldn't begin to tell you where exactly it was. But I'm guessing it was just before the speakers and after everything else because it's got to eat up a lot of volume. And it's got to make it so that the volume doesn't blow the speaker cones across the room and embed them in the wall or whatever, or turn them into fine dust. But regardless of all that, it's not something I can teach people. I can't teach people how to recognize sound. You have to be able to do that. You have to know how these things sound, each thing. And you got to know how to adjust an EQ, an equalizer. The equalizers are so important. They are the basis for the formation of tones. The guitar is a very tiny, tiny bit. I mean, yes, we have all these fancy guitars that look cool. I mean, hell, and they're fun to play. And some of them play better than others. And some of them function better than others. But pots and caps and shit. The only thing that really does, in my experience, from what I've seen, and I don't care, people can try to tell me otherwise what they want, because there's a lot of magic and hocus pocus that a lot of people believe in when it comes to guitar playing. There is no magic. It's very form and function. But people will believe that certain pots and caps will give them certain sound or specific sound, or this sounds better than this. I gotta have orange drops. I gotta have oil filled. I gotta have paper and oil filled. It gets ridiculous after a while, and all it is marketing. That's really what it comes down to. I've gotten great sounds out of dime pots. I've gotten great sounds out of bigger pots. You know, the bigger regular pots, quarter sized, and I've gotten crappy sounds out of either one. And it doesn't really matter. It's all what you do and how you equalize it. Because anything that comes out of that guitar can be equalized. And if you don't believe me, listen to a guitar just flat with no EQ, no amp, no nothing, just coming through your interface or whatever. And just listen to it. Or get something that's like a really cheap small amplifier, put nothing on it, nothing, flat EQ the whole 9 yards, no distortion, no nothing, and just listen to it. You won't hear much in the way of tone through it. You might hear things with different pickups, but it's really the amplification and the equalization that does it. And then you also get into things like speakers and microphones, which some speakers sound a specific way. Other speakers sound another way, and different microphones work with different speakers. And then there's mic placement on speakers. This isn't something I can teach you. It's something that you have to recognize and learn just by seeing it in practice. I mean, I could tell you about a million things. Like I could tell somebody who's blind what the sun looks like when it rises. But are they ever going to know unless they see it for themselves? No, they're not going to know. So you have to experience these things for yourself. That is the best advice I could give you on tone. And it doesn't come from the guitar. Contrary to what frickin' Tonewood people say, contrary to what frickin' guitar manufacturers say, tone does not come from an electric guitar. An acoustic guitar, yes, because that is your entire sound coming out of that acoustic guitar. You know, an acoustic electric is a little different where they can adjust certain things. But a regular acoustic that's where all your sound is coming from, that guitar. So Tonewood exists on an acoustic guitar. But an electric guitar that you plug in, as soon as the second you plug it in, all that Tonewood business goes right out the window, because it's all about the speaker, it's all about the pickups and the magnetic field between the pickups. Your nut doesn't change your tone. You know, wood doesn't change your tone, none of that stuff. And I've discussed that at length. And people are going to either believe it or not believe it, whatever. You can believe in magical fairies and unicorns and centaurs, you know, and goblins and ghouls and shit, but doesn't make them real. You know, you can believe in them all you want, and you can swear, you know, that they are. There's people that swear the earth is flat. But, you know, going off on a tangent there. But the thing is, when it comes down to it, know how to use an equalizer. That's the best advice I can give you. Know how to use an equalizer. Know how to recognize guitar tones as far as, you know, how they achieved it. And if you can't figure that out, then research it. Go online. Google it, or whatever search engine you use. This is like, how did Andy Summers get his guitar tone for whatever Police album? or how did Gary Richrath, or how did Eddie Van Halen, or how did Jimi Hendrix get his tone? And you'll find people who know this stuff. I mean, Jimi Hendrix used a fuzz face, and he used Marshalls, and he put his heavily fuzzed Stratocaster, into the Marshall, and that's how he did it. And there were other things he used here and there, but you have to look through each thing. Aerosmith's album, a lot of people who went through Electric Lady Studios, which was Hendrix's studio he created in New York City, there was an amp there, and it's an old 50s Fender Tweed amp, maybe a Bassman or something, I don't know. But these people who made albums there, most of them used that amp. As one, it was Jimi Hendrix's amp that he gave to the studio, and two, it was famous. It was there. They didn't have to rent any amps or bring in any amps, so they didn't have to do anything. It was all right. It was sitting right there. And Aerosmith, for their album Toys in the Attic, and I don't know how many more albums that they used it on, but they used that amp for the entire album. The entire album. There's no Marshalls on that album. It's all that little Tweed amp. And, all Joe did was bring in his 59 Les Paul, and that's what they did. And I think he had a few other guitars too. But it all went through that Tweed amp. They had recorded that entire album with the Tweed amp, as far as the guitar goes. Bass and other things like that. A lot of these people will use amps that are at they'll use the amps that are at the studio. Famous bands too. A lot of times they won't bring in their own equipment. They'll use the stuff that's at the studio, because there's stuff at the studio that's somewhat comparable to what they use. And all the magic is done at the mixing board, at the recording console. That's where the magic happens. All the tone shaping, all that stuff is done there. And it's because the producer has an ear and can hear things that I could never hear. Unless I had like 50 years or 40 years of producing experience. I don't have producing experience. I just have guitar experience. I shape tones through that. But people, these producers will sit there and they can hear things, perfect ear for it. They can hear things that other people can't hear. They can hear stuff that's not even in the song yet. Stuff that belongs in certain spots because they can hear it in their minds. And they know that this stuff belongs in this spot, and this belongs in this spot, and this part right here, try adding this. And that's how it's done. It's not done through any kind of magic. There's nothing to it. It's all being able to hear and recognize different things. And if you don't know, do research. Just look up on the web for specific people. Ask, how did this guy get his tone? How did Mark Knopfler get his tone? How did Clapton get his tone? I mean, what amps were they using on this album? What amps were they using on this album? And you'll find some debate, yeah, but usually they, will have interviews with the actual band members that will tell you what they used. And then you can take whatever amp you have, or amp modeler, or amp sim, and you can form the tones yourself, and you can put it together, and you can equalize it for your particular speakers or whatever pickups you're using and stuff, and you can equalize it for your situation. You're never going to sound exactly like them, but hey, you can get close, and I've gotten plenty close. I've matched a ton of tones. And it doesn't matter if your guitar is a $500,000 1959 Les Paul, or if it's a $200 Epiphone Les Paul Special 2. You're still going to be able to get the same tones. And people don't want to believe that, because it's all ego that's tied into buying guitars and shit. And of course, it's all with the the companies and everything. So, that's the way it is. So how do I shape tone? I listen. That's how I shape tone. And I know what effects sound like what. And I know how to adjust an equalizer. Get to know equalizers. That is the primary importance. Plug it into an amp and playing is never going to work. And just adjusting the knobs on the front of an amp you'll never shape tones that way. You might do a little bit of adjusting, and there might be something that's very basic you get out of it. But if you want specific tones, then you're going to have to compensate for that mixing board and for that recording console, because that's where the magic happens, and that's where your effects, your microphones, all that stuff, you have to think not only like a guitar player or a musician of any type, but you have to think like a producer. And I can't teach you that. That's something you have to learn. It takes time. But anyway, that is all I've got. That is pretty much all I can say about this. And so, if you want to know how to get guitar tones and stuff, that's it. You have to be able to listen, and you have to know how to use specific effects and equalizers and how specific amps act and stuff. And amps aren't all that different from each other either. There's another little thing that the manufacturers don't want you to know. A Soldano and an EVH amp aren't all that different from each other. A Marshall and, say, an Egnator, or even one of those new Friedmans, not much different from each other. I mean, they're all using pretty much the same electronics, and there's very little difference between them. Just get a good one that sounds good to you, or use whatever amps you want. Vox sounds different than Marshall. Fender sounds different from Marshall. Those are the big differences. It's like a Stratocaster sounds different than a Les Paul, and it's all scale length there. But it's hard to say. You just have to listen. You have to do research. That's all I got for you. There's nothing else I can tell you about it. I mean, you can ask me a million times, and that's the only thing I can tell you. So, good luck. Listen, learn, know what sounds like what, and for God's sakes, use a damn equalizer. In fact, use two, because that's what I do. I use two equalizers. A shelving equalizer as a boost, and also as a sound shaper, and a regular graphic equalizer. And sometimes even I might use three, or use compression. It's all in the ears. That's all there is to it. Recognize it and learn it, and that's all you need to do. It's not anything I can teach you. So, thank you very much for watching, and I hope this was in some way helpful to you. Have a good evening, day, morning, whatever time you're watching this.